Hey guys, Frosty Knives here. I'm back with another book review. And today we are going to be taking a look at another book by Stephen King. Today we are going to be talking about From a Buick 8. We're going to be talking about From a Buick 8 in two ways. One, as a novel, and two, as a Doc Tower book, because From a Buick 8 is one of the books that has connections to Stephen King's Tower series. So first, let's just get the particulars out of the way. First of all, the cover, really nice cover from on the hardcover. Stephen King, From a Buick 8, and then it wraps around and there are Buicks everywhere. So I've always liked this cover. So this book was written in 2002. It was published in 2002, and it clocks in at 351 pages. And the story of From a Buick 8 is story of Ned Wilcox. And Ned Wilcox's father, Curtis, was a Pennsylvania State Police trooper out of Troop D in Pennsylvania. And one day, while he was on a routine traffic stop, he was hit and killed by another car on the side of the highway. And Ned, his son, after his death, started hanging around at the troop. And troop at this point was led by Sandy Dearborn. He was in charge. And he started hanging around, and they started showing him the ropes. And he started learning a little bit about police work. They taught him dispatch work, and they let him run the radio, and they let him do different things. And it was a way for him to sort of connect to his father's work and his father's life. Started talking to the people in the troop that his father worked with that had known his father for a long time. And they started telling him stories, and it was sort of a way, I think, for Ned to sort of process through his grief by touching that part of his father's life that was pretty much his father's life, was being a cop. And eventually Ned finds out about the dirty little secret that's sitting in Shed B. And that would be a Buick Roadmaster 8 that is sitting in the shed. And Ned asks about it, and Sandy decides to tell him the story of the Buick. And the story of the Buick goes back quite a while, many years, a couple of decades. And then Sandy talks about it, and eventually everybody else begins to talk about it as well. And they tell Ned the story of the Buick and why it's in their care. And so many years ago, this Buick pulls up to a gas station and for a fill-up, and then the man who is driving the Buick tells him the oil's fine, and then it walks off into the woods and then disappears and abandons the Buick. And so the person that was running the gas station calls the police, and they come and confiscate the Buick, bring it back to the shed. And they quickly find out that the Buick is not a Buick. It looks like a Buick, but it doesn't look like a Buick. It is made to look like a Buick, but it looks wrong. And you begin to find out that this Buick that's not really a Buick, is not from this world. And then things over the years begin to happen with this Buick. See, the Buick looks like a Buick, but it doesn't work. It doesn't drive. Everything is wrong. The steering wheel is wrong. The engine is wrong. Things are just wrong with this thing. It's trying too hard to look like a car. And then things begin to happen. And they find out that things generally begin to happen around the trunk of the Buick. And things eventually start coming out of the trunk of the Buick, and then people start disappearing around the Buick. Animals start disappearing around the Buick. And so the story really is it's how they begin to examine the Buick and find out what it is and what it does and where it came from and whatnot. In addition to things coming out of the Buick's trunk, and in addition to people and animals disappearing around the Buick, every once in a while the Buick begins to shoot off what they call light quakes, where blasts of purple lightning and light will begin to shoot out of the Buick. And that happens periodically over the years. They never really figure out where the Buick comes from, and they never really figure out what the Buick is, and they never really figure out the people who disappear in the Buick. They don't really never figure out where they go. And the things that come out of the Buick, they never really figure out where they're coming from. So really, this is a story about trying to explain the unexplainable. Trying to explain things that have no explanation. They're there, and it happens, and it's a thing, but you can't really explain it. Some things just don't have any explanations. And it's the story of the Buick is a metaphor, right, for Ned as he's trying to deal with the grief of his father's death and why did his father have to die, and wrestling with all the questions that Ned has. You know, why did it have to happen to him? Why did it have to happen that way? Could things have happened differently? And as he's sort of questioning about the Buick, he's really wrestling with those types of questions that just can't be answered. You know, and Sandy, as he's telling him the story, basically keeps telling him, you're looking for answers to questions. We don't have the answers. And some questions just have no answers. And you're going to have to accept the fact that there are just things in life that happen, and we don't know why, and we'll never know why, and they have no explanation, and no matter how we try to tie it up into nice little bows, they're never going to be explained. And so at the end of the book, Ned finally wrestles with the question of the Buick and the feelings around his father's death, and he sort of wraps that all up and realizes that there are just some things in the world that you're never going to explain. So that's the story of From a Buick 8, right, in a nutshell. It's the story of what happens when something is dropped on your doorstep that has no way to explain it, and what do you do with it? What do you do with it? And in this case, they have decided that for whatever reason, they've decided that it was their job to protect the Buick and to shield it from other people. So they keep it in their shed at Troop D and just sort of watch over it. And it's, highly insinuated that eventually, we don't know when, how long down the road, but eventually the Buick is winding down, and eventually the Buick will destroy itself, or will just cease to be. So it's really not a bad story, but there's really not a lot of, there's no explanations to it, and I think that's the purpose of the book, right? Purpose of the book is to take a concept of what do you do when you're presented with something that you can't explain, and how do you handle that, and how do you move forward with the knowledge that you have something that cannot be explained. So that's the story about the Buick. But there's another layer to that, which is the story of how does the Buick tie in to the Dark Tower. Well, I can tell you what I think, and I can tell you what other people think, because I've read about it, different things. So let's talk about it. One of the ideas that are kicking around out in the internet is that the person that dropped the Buick off in the book, it's just described as a man in a black trench coat and a black hat who drops the Buick off at the gas station and then disappears. Never heard from again. Many people, and I've heard people think that potentially this could be Randall Flagg. I do not believe that that this person that dropped the Buick off is Randall Flagg. Mostly because whenever Stephen King introduces Randall Flagg in a book, he does it one of two ways. Yes, Randall Flagg is known as the Man in Black, but he does it one of two ways. He either talks about the little happy face button that Randall Flagg is always wearing. That shows up a lot on when he doesn't name Randall Flagg outright in a book. They'll talk about the little happy face pin that Randall's always wearing. And generally always usually if he does name the character, it'll be an RF name. For example, in Gwendy's button box, when the Man in Black came to Gwendy and gave her the button box, he introduced himself as Richard Farris. And we know, as a reader, that that's Randall Flagg. Randall Flagg is going as Russell Faraday. Randall Flagg has gone as all different kinds of names. But it's always an RF, right? It's always an RF name. So I don't think the Man in Black that dropped off the Buick is Randall Flagg. I do, however, think that it's highly possible that the person that dropped off the Buick was a low man. It's very possible that it was one of the Cantoi. The Buick acts a lot, is very similar to a lot of the cars that the low men drive in the Dark Tower series. When you specifically, I believe it's in the last two books, The Song of Susanna and the Dark Tower. Very similar to what the low men drive. So there's that connection. It's probably the case that if it's not a thinny that's in the trunk of the Buick, then the trunk of the Buick is a conduit. And the trunk of the Buick is a conduit to, if not to Roland's world per se, but I think the Buick's trunk is a conduit to Todash space. Because the things that come out of the Buick, and they're really wild things that come out of the Buick's trunk, they're very similar to how King describes the creatures that live in Todash space. They're also very similar to how Stephen King describes the creatures in The Mist. If you read The Mist, the creatures that are in the mist, that are flying around in the mist, are very similar to what's coming out of the Buick. And the creatures that are coming out of the mist is very much the creatures that are coming out of Todash space. So I think the trunk is a conduit to either Todash space itself or to a world in the Tower verse that maybe we just don't know about. But there is that connection because those creatures that are coming out of it are Todash creatures. The other thing that is interesting to note, as far as, and these are my two takeaways from the book. The other thing that's interesting to note is that, number one, the light quakes that are coming out of the Buick are purple. It's purple light quakes. Why purple? Why purple? Why did King choose purple? I don't know why he chose purple, particularly. But if you remember, in the Dark Tower first book, in The Gunslinger, when Walter sends Roland on his vision quest at the end, and when Walter makes Roland see all of existence, Roland sees everything all boiled down to a single blade of purple grass. Purple grass, right? So I think the fact that the Buick is spitting out purple lightning is maybe a nod or a hint to the purple grass that Roland saw when he went on the vision quest, when Walter sent him on the vision quest. The other thing that I noticed upon rereading this, and I'm going to read it right out of the book because it's on page 150. I made a mental note of that. On that, they say, here's what Stephen King said about the Buick. He says, and what he said, I remember this clear as the sky in a summer morning, was that we saw it as a Buick because we had to see it as something. Now think about that. We saw it as a Buick because we had to see it as something. Just like the losers saw it as a spider because they had to see it as something. They couldn't wrap their heads around what it really looked like, so the most that they could see was a spider. Much like Sandy Dearborn and Kurtz Wilcox and everybody else in Troop D couldn't really see the Buick for what it was, so they saw it as a Buick. So there's my takeaways for Dark Tower Connections. It's really interesting that Stephen King were to write this. This is the second book that Stephen King wrote that sort of really revolves around a haunted car, like Christine. He loves doing these haunted car motifs. He wrote Christine. He wrote From a Buick 8. That came up in that idea also came up in Nevil Things. All the cars that the low men drove around. So there's a lot of connections to the Tower. If you're going to read the Tower books and you're going to read the Tower series, I would read this as well. You don't have to read this in the middle. You can finish all of the Tower books. And then this is like an addendum. Like you can read this after you've journeyed through the Tower and read the whole story. It's like an addendum. It's like a little footnote or a little addendum or a little side story to the Tower series. I gave this book a 4 out of 5 on Goodreads. A lot of people, they may not like the fact that it doesn't really have a nice little ending, doesn't really wrap it up in a nice little bow. But I think that's the point. I think that's the point of this story. Like I said, I think Stephen King really wrote a story because he wrote this around the time. I think he wrote, if I remember correctly, he wrote it before he had his accident. And then this kind of fell by the wayside. And then after his accident, he went back to this. I think Stephen King wanted to really write a story about what happens when something completely unknowable is dropped in our lap. And how do we handle that? And we got From a Buick 8. So there's really no answers. There's really no concrete answers. There's really no concrete ending. The Buick is still around. For all we know, the Buick is still around. Buick is still around at the end of the book, and the Buick, nobody, Ned doesn't get good answers. Sandy doesn't get good answers. None of the people at Troop D get good answers, and the reader doesn't get good, solid answers. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay to have something where you don't have good, solid answers because it lets your mind wander and it lets your mind think about, what the possibilities, right? Because that's where the creative stuff is. That's where the good ideas come from, is when you let your mind wander and you start asking the what if question. What if? What if it is this? What if it's not this? What does this mean? So I think there's a lot of ground to cover in this book as far as what is it? Where did it come from? And why did he drop it off? Why did the Buick get dropped off in the first place? Was it just for shits and giggles? Maybe. We'll never know. But I don't think we're meant to know. Just like Ned is never going to get the deal with his father's death. It's never going to be wrapped up nicely in a tiny little bow and you're going to be handed the answer. He's going to have to wrestle with that for the rest of his life. As just like we're going to have to think about, if we choose to, what the Buick means for, every time we read it or think about it. So I gave this a 4 out of 5, and I think it's a good book. I remember not liking it or not really enjoying it the first time around or thinking it was an okay book, but this time that I read it, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot more than I did the first time, and that's probably just a perspective of age. That's probably just being in a different place now than I was when I read it the first time, being in a different situation now than I was the first time, because let's face it, we're in the middle, right? Right now, we ourselves are asking questions how to deal with things that are dropped into our lap with current situations going on, and we're asking, what do we do and why and where did this come from? Much like what Ned and Curtis and Sandy were dealing with, why. And we may get a little more, we'll get a little more concrete answers, I think, than they did in the Buick, but it's just still a time of a questioning. So maybe that's why I liked it a little bit more than I did the first time around. Excuse me. So guys, this is my review from a Buick 8, and it's not a bad read. It's a good read. I think it's a decent book, and you're really not going to get a lot of answers, but I don't think you were meant to get a lot of answers, and that is okay. It's okay to not get a lot of answers. So I hope you enjoyed that review. I think that potentially you should read this, and I think you should probably own it, and it should probably, go on your shelf. And then once you've finished all of your Dark Tower books, you can go and read the extra stuff, sort of just to get more of a flavor of the Dark Tower verse universe. So, guys, I hope you enjoyed that review. Thank you for watching, and tell your friends and tell your enemies and pass it around. And as always, until next time, I will see you in the next video.